All right, well, thank you all for coming. My name is Kyle Jon Sepe, and my thesis is entitled The Chosen People, Choosing Which Party, Jewish Millennials and American Politics. And for my thesis, I looked at why Jewish Americans are showing a greater affinity for Republican presidential candidates, despite being historically aligned with the Democratic Party. And so in my preliminary research at Oxford, I was struck at how Jewish millennials are more likely to identify as a Republican in recent polls that I looked at, but are also the least religiously observant Jewish age cohort. And I kind of found that to be quite interesting, and I wanted to look into that a bit more. And so I believe that this research is significant because if there is a potential change that's going on within this demographic, and most Jews are concentrated in electorally significant states, that this could potentially influence a presidential election in the future. So essentially, Jewish Americans were hands down aligned with the Democratic Party. And according to election results, they still are for the most part. However, there was one aspect that I found to be quite fascinating, and this was since 1992, the Jewish support for Republican presidential candidates has slowly but consistently increased to a point where, if comparing in 1992, George H.W. Bush received about 11% of the Jewish vote, and in the most recent presidential election, Mitt Romney received 30%, so they've nearly tripled their support for Republican candidates. And my findings suggest that Jewish millennials are driving the Jewish Americans to trend more Republican, particularly because of their views on economic issues and low religious salience, and I'll talk about that in just a little bit. So I'm just going to read these questions first. Why have Jewish Americans primarily identified with the Democratic Party? I think we need to answer that question first. Why have Republican presidential candidates begun to cut into the Jewish vote in recent presidential elections? Why and which Jewish age cohorts are driving this change in party support in recent presidential elections? And are Jewish millennials more likely to identify as Republicans than other Jews? And why would that be? And so one religious and political scholar, Robert Booth Fowler, links religious salience and religious traditions to voting behavior. So therefore, I speculate that if I find that Jewish values, religious values in particular, are progressive, then the least religious Jewish age cohorts could potentially be more open to Republican ideas. In my thesis, I use both qualitative and quantitative methods. So for my qualitative methods, in addition to using primary sources, I conduct 2 open-ended interviews with a member of Congress and a Reform rabbi. Congressman Leonard Lance is my congressman in my district, and I was an intern for him a few years ago and got him to speak here at the college, so I have a pretty good relationship. And Rabbi Randy Musnitsky is a Reform rabbi at Temple Har Shalom in my hometown, so I wanted to get a religious perspective interviewing her. For my quantitative methods in SPSS, I used the 2012 Jewish Values Survey, which was just recently released by Public Religion Research Institute, to conduct a bivariate analysis using the cross-tabulation feature in SPSS to determine if there's a statistical relationship between Jewish age cohort and various religious and political dependent variables. So just a little bit of historical background. I can get more into this if you want in the question and answer part. But so there are potentially biblical and historic explanations for why Jews have been historically aligned with the Democratic Party. One in particular for biblical explanations is the book of Exodus, specifically the Exodus narrative of Jews as slaves in Egypt. This could potentially lead them to be more empathetic to for other minorities. And this idea was first proposed by a sociologist, Werner Cohen is his name. He was a prominent sociologist who focused on the sociology of Jews in particular. And this idea was further explored by University of Florida professor Kenneth Wald. And he said that the predominant liberalism of American Jews is related to the emancipation of Jews in modern Europe. And opposing civil equality were conservatives, monarchists, clericals, and Catholics. And so the association with being Jewish and being a Democrat has really always been there. And in conjunction with the Jewish immigrant experience, which I'll talk about in the next part there. So possible well, before I get there first, I'm missing one part. There are very progressive Jewish religious values, and one in particular, tikkun olam, is a very important phrase that is used in many Jewish temples and synagogues and could influence voting behavior. Tikkun olam means repairing the world or healing the world, and this is derived from the Mishnah, which is a redaction to the Oral Torah. And there's always been an association with, in order to repair and change the world, progressive and liberal change is necessary. And so many scholars have argued that conservatism, which in its general philosophy is to retain past traditions, could be antithetical to Jewish values. So that's just one potential explanation. Historical explanations. Many Jewish immigrants were left-leaning. One in particular, a good example, is the General Jewish Labor Bund of Lithuania, Poland, and Russia. Many Jewish immigrants were part of this secular Jewish socialist party. And around 1920, the General Jewish Labor Bund was, I think, officially no longer in existence. But many of these immigrants who came to America influenced politics here. And so one example of this is in the 1920 presidential election, when third-party socialist candidate Eugene Debs garnered about 40% of the Jewish vote. So there's clearly been an impact there. And so there are other reasons stated here, but I want to bring your attention to views on secularism and separation of church and state, which Jews take very seriously. I have about 13 figures in my thesis, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to show you 6 of them. And so as you can see here, figure 1 shows Jewish support in presidential elections over time. And I start in 1932 because modern-day polling practices were first started around this time, and social scientists used voting data in a more systematic manner. So there are fluctuations over time, as you can see here. However, since 1992, there seems to be something that stands out to me, which is a slow but consistent increase in support for Republican candidates. So this could potentially be not only on a case-by-case basis or candidate-by-candidate basis, but there could be something else going on, and so I want to dig deeper into that. So from this point on, all my figures are based off of my analysis, and all of my findings are statistically significant, and all the p-values are cited at the bottom of each figure. And so what I found using the 2012 Jewish Values Survey released by PRI, Jewish millennials 18 to 29 are statistically more likely to identify as a Republican than any other Jewish age cohort. And younger Jews do seem to be more open to at least identifying as a Republican. And so, but let's look at specific issues to try to figure out, well, why is this the case? The next thing that I looked at was importance of religion by age cohort. And this is something that's so fascinating to me because Jewish millennials are significantly more likely to not view religion as an important aspect in their life. More than half, according to my findings here. But looking back at figure 2, the younger Jewish age cohorts are more open to being a Republican. So this to me seemed kind of paradoxical in a sense, because if one is less religious, they're potentially more likely to identify as a Democrat. Less religious, potentially more likely to identify as a Democrat. So this seemed kind of confusing a little bit. But hopefully after this, it won't be so confusing. But talking about confusing, this was the most confusing statistic finding in my research, and it was the view of the Palestinian state and the establishment of a Palestinian state. So in the survey, the question asked was, generally speaking, would you support or oppose the establishment of a Palestinian state? And this is what I found. Jewish millennials have the complete opposite view of every other Jewish age cohort, but they're also the least religiously observant Jewish age cohort. And the Palestinian state obviously has religious connotations to it. So this could be, regardless, what's driving Jews to be more Republican, or some have suggested that party elites have a really large influence on shaping how people within their own party view a certain issue. That could be the case. But in order to really delve into this issue and determining specific factors for why this is the case, a multivariate analysis is needed. I look at a variety of social issues, and one in particular, support for abortion rights, was not very surprising to me because Jews have always been very liberal, especially on social issues. But it is noteworthy that younger Jewish age cohorts are slightly more pro-life, but this is probably not what's driving Jews to be more Republican. That number is just so small there. But this is, I think, one of the most important findings, views on economic issues. I looked at a variety of issues, views on the very wealthy, taxes, raising taxes, views on Wall Street, and Jewish millennials consistently had the most conservative viewpoint when asked in these series of questions. And so this one in particular was quite interesting to me. When asked, do you agree or disagree that the economic system in this country favors the very wealthy? And I specifically did not recode these variables, which would have collapsed those like responses, so we could see how Jews responded in each of these 4 categories. And as you can see here in figure 6, Jewish millennials are statistically 2 times more likely to say they completely disagree with that statement than any other Jewish age cohort. And I found similar results on issues like raising taxes. So they do hold the most conservative viewpoints on these issues. But so why is this the case? Potentially, this could be Jewish millennials could be losing these progressive Jewish values that I mentioned before, and because they're less religious. And in one of my questions that I asked in my interview with Rabbi Miznitzky, we can talk more about that if you want in the question segment. But one thing that she said, which I found quite interesting, was that she argued that Jewish millennials and even millennials in general, even though they're less religious, they are raised to think about themselves, really haven't took part in the civil rights movement or other social movements, the women's rights movement. And so potentially these issues are not that important to them. So if being selfish makes people more economically conservative, well, take that as you want. But so that leads into something that I wanted to compare in my thesis based off of what Rabbi Miznitzky said. And that is, there could be a generational influence on Jewish millennials in particular, in addition to my theory that they're losing these progressive Jewish values and are therefore more likely to be Republican. But there could be this generational influence that Rabbi Miznitzky talked about. So their politics could be shaped less by religious background and more on generational experiences. So being raised to think about themselves. So I did want to compare millennials to Jewish millennials very briefly. I couldn't do it in SPSS. But generally speaking, there does seem to be some similarity between the two. About the same identify as a Republican, which is very interesting. And both seem to be open to fiscal conservatism. Just one example for Jewish millennials, it was in figure 6. But I just want to pull a quote from the 2012 Millennial Value Survey that I briefly looked at. And one of the findings was 56% of college-age millennials agree that government has gotten bigger because it has gotten involved in things that people should do for themselves. Another example that they found, 67% of college-age millennials, so our age, believe that the poor in America are, quote, too dependent on government assistance programs. So that's a pretty substantial number. But again, I couldn't determine statistical significance because I didn't run this through SPSS. So more or less, this raises questions for future research. So I'll go ahead and read these concluding statements first, and then I can say a little bit about some of them. So the first thing that I found was that Jewish millennials are overwhelmingly Democrat in their views on political issues and in their voting behavior. But younger Jews, in particular, are trending more Republican, but still a plurality identify as a Democrat. Therefore, Jewish millennials are most likely contributing to the success that Republican candidates have been having in the past few presidential elections. Jewish millennials are more conservative in their economic views than other Jewish age cohorts, but are still very liberal on social issues and are the least religiously observant. And then there's that interesting finding where Jewish millennials overwhelmingly oppose the establishment of the Palestinian state. Jews could be losing these values because of the fact that they could not be making this historical link between being Jewish and being a Democrat. Jewish millennials may have similar views on political issues as millennials overall. And finally, a more complete explanation of these specific factors. In order for that to identify those factors, a multivariate analysis would be necessary. But so what does all of this even mean for future presidential elections? And I always go back to Florida. I have family in Florida, so it's a very important state for many different reasons. But politically speaking, it's a very important swing state, and many Jews are concentrated in the state of Florida, and even in Ohio and in Northern Virginia too, and those are all swing states. So you can view this two different ways. If you're a Democrat, this could be just business as usual, because Jews are still very Democrat in their views, and Jews are a minority. So this may not really even impact the presidential election. Or if you're a Republican, this could be good news, because you've essentially tripled your support in the past 20 years. And that's quite stunning. And if most Jews are concentrated in these electorally significant states, then a slight change in voting behavior, as my study suggests, could have an impact in future presidential elections. And so that's what I have for you now. But before we go to the question segment, I just want to thank my thesis advisor, Dr. Melissa Deckman, for guiding me through this process and supporting me through this process. And without you, it wouldn't have been possible. So thank you all. Thank you.
I'll let you run the
Okay. Yes.
So what year is that then? 60, 40, 45, 39?
Looks like Reagan.
Yeah, so that's 1980. So Jimmy Carter did not really fare well. This was really the only time that a Democrat received less than 50% of the Jewish vote. And so many people speculate this for many different reasons. Ronald Reagan was a firm supporter of Israel, and I don't want to say that Jimmy Carter was not, but that's definitely implied, I think. One example of this, he and a UN, I can't remember the guy's name, but a UN ambassador had supported an amendment to, it would essentially eliminate Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. And so even through the Camp David Accords, Jimmy Carter seemed to be in favor more so of the Arabs, especially after the signing of the Camp David Accords. And even into his post-presidency, he's, not that that's relevant to 1980, but generally speaking, it's the attitude, the mindset. He had very anti-Semitic viewpoints. I think in one of his books, he said that Israel is an apartheid state or something along those lines. I'm just paraphrasing. But he did say apartheid. He did say that.
I just disagree with the categorization of Jimmy Carter as an anti-Semite.
Yeah. Well, so I'm not saying he's an anti-Semite, but I'm saying those inklings were potentially there, and as you can see in 1980, that's definitely quite evident that Jews agreed. Any other questions?
And then, so it's 54, then, and 60, 40? So that would have been a presidential year, 56.
Yeah, so that's good. Yeah, so that was Eisenhower. Yes, and so many Jews in particular believe that Eisenhower was a war hero after World War II and was a firm supporter of Israel, and that was a very important issue in that time. Yeah. Katie?
So historically, it looks like Jews already fluctuate sort of between their support for a Democratic president versus a Republican president. Do you believe that this is going to continue to be an upward trajectory, or do you think it's just sort of falling in line with the pattern?
Yeah, so I didn't look into too much detail in all these different presidential elections. The survey that was released was just from 2012. It was released even before the actual presidential election. These data points were not taken from my analysis. They were just taken from Pew Research. And I think that it's a very good question because the Jewish vote has fluctuated over time, and you can see that according to this figure. But looking at those specific issues, those specific time periods where you see those spikes, I attribute that to Israel in particular. But I think now that's why I think this is so interesting, because Jewish millennials in particular don't even really view Israel as an important issue when I was going through some of those questions in SPSS. So will it continue to increase? I think so, because now it's not just Israel that's an issue. It seems like, based off of my research, it's also economic issues too.
Maybe we should be looking at millennials as a whole and not necessarily dividing them up into religious, non-religious, Jewish, black, white, maybe just looking at them as an entire population and sort of predicting.
Yeah, and so that's why I had an amazing interview with Rabbi Musnitsky, because that's what she was suggesting, that this could be just millennials in general. And so it seems like we're seeing that, where millennials are at least open to fiscal conservatism, but are also very socially liberal, as we all know. And I don't know what that holds for the two political parties, but I do see this trend increasing, but very, very slowly. It's not like in 2016 it's going to be, above 50%. It might just be around 30, but yeah. Yes.
I just have to say that I so enjoyed reading your thesis. I mean, I thought that it was tremendously well done. I thought that your research questions were nice and clear, and your methodology was sound. And I have to say, I really enjoyed your narrative. There's not a but coming here.
I was going to ask what that is.
Tyler, don't lavish praise like this, so you can relax and enjoy it for a moment.
But I'm ready, so.
There's not a but coming, except that, no. But I mean, and what I so enjoyed about it also, there were so many surprises in the data. So many little nuggets of surprises that, because I hate reading something where I think I already know the answer, and damn it if I don't, But so I really loved that it opened new doors, and I also loved that there were so many other questions that would potentially spawn off of your thesis. I must have come up with 5 or 6 other thesis topics just reading your thesis. And I was particularly intrigued about the point about support for Israel and an increased exposure, or the number of millennials who've actually been to Jerusalem, and perhaps that having an interesting influence about it. But my question for you, after all of the praise without the but, is had you time and resources, what kind of multivariate analysis would you have liked to have done? I mean, if Dr. Detman just let you run wild, what would you have liked to have added, that you think might have tweaked the outcomes that you got?
So, on a particular issue, or?
Anything. Your choice. If there's just
to me,
you've just been really bothered that you couldn't do.
So going back to the issue of the Palestinian state, I ran this 5 times, and I talked to Dr. Deckman about this. It just confused the heck out of me, because it just really didn't make any sense to me. For the issue of abortion, okay, that makes sense. We know that. The economic stuff, okay, I was kind of suggesting that from the beginning, but to me, I would have liked to really look at views on Israel and the Palestinian state in particular. So I would have done something with that. But unfortunately, I haven't really had a lot of exposure to doing multivariate analysis. So yeah, I wasn't really,
Just thinking, like, could it be, you know, level of educational attainment differences?
I see.
Or
I see.
trips to Jerusalem, like you were sort of thinking. I mean, like, it just, it was probably one of
yeah.
my favorite takeaways from your whole thesis this point, right? Because it was so surprising.
I would have also liked to determine if there were any differences between different different Jewish sects, if you will, like so like Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox. That to me would have been really interesting to break that down, because Reform overwhelmingly identify as Democrats, and Orthodox it seems like it's the complete opposite. But conservatives are also, conservative Jews are very liberal in their political views too, so I would have liked to look at that a bit more.
You did, and it's perfect that you came to this slide, because it's, not only do I have a question, but I want to refer to that graph, so you anticipated me. So I wonder, I can see how presidential elections are a convenient data set to look over time at Jewish support for Republicans or Democrats. But I wonder if you considered other ways to consider Jewish support for Republicans and Democrats. Like, is there data? Maybe there just isn't data available. But you know, like for example, like the percentage of the national vote in Congress for Republicans or Democrats or their electoral districts.
Well, so you bring up a good point, because the survey that I looked at was a very interesting survey, primarily because of the, I'm just trying to think of the right words. It was a very rare survey in a sense because of the sample size. So there were about over 1,000 Jews that were sampled of all different age groups, and they asked so many issues, like a variety of, very comprehensive survey, and I think that was one of the questions too. You know, support for Congress, things like that. So I couldn't look at every single of those issues, so I tried to pick out, generally just in the beginning stages of this research, those specific religious and political issues, so like abortion or Israel or views on the very wealthy, things like that. But the survey was, I think, so comprehensive and rare that we really haven't seen a lot of that yet. But so does that kind of answer the question?
Well, kind of, but let me ask a follow-up.
Okay.
A clarification, so if we can use this graph.
Okay.
So this shows the Jewish support of the two parties in the presidential election, but do you think that it generally shows the Jewish support for the Republican Party and the Democratic Party in those years? So, like, we pick like the close year that we established was the Carter year. So then, can we sort of take from this that basically 45% of Jews supported Republicans in general, or is it just, it's just Carter that they didn't like, but actually they're Democrats, so maybe, you know, they're still like 80% Democrats.
Yeah.
support.
You mean like a protest?
Yeah, protest vote or.
Yeah, I would think it's more of that, the second part, that's the second aspect that you said. But so this is what I have. This is just from my analysis. But I think, generally speaking, those spikes were attributed to the specific individual candidate. I want to bring up another example here. Look at, I think it was 1964, with Barry Goldwater, is 1964? Barry Goldwater, 10%, it was so low. But for another very liberal candidate in the 70s, George McGovern, where we start to see this decrease in the early 70s. It did seem to be attributed to the issue of Israel, and especially with George McGovern, the rise of the New Left, they tended to have more sympathy for Palestine and for the Arab community, as opposed to Republicans. So I would attribute those spikes specifically to the candidate itself. So basically what I would say is that just because 45% of Democrats voted for Jimmy Carter, that doesn't mean that 45% of Jews are Democrats.
I'm sorry.
Mr. Prudhomme?
So you don't have, therefore don't have any data about party affiliation going back decades?
Not going back decades, not for what I looked at, yeah. Dr. Hopper?
I wanted to ask, in American politics, when you have a demographic group that has
has for so long been associated with one political party, and the tendency of the other political parties maybe to write them off and not be trying to mobilize them. And so I'm curious as to what you think the role, if there is any, is the Republican Party overtly trying to mobilize or reach out to Jewish millennials, or is this really just kind of from the ground up, they're looking at issue positions and making determinations that way? Is there outreach to, is part of it driven by party politics as opposed to just their opinions?
So are you asking what should Democrats and Republicans do from this point on, or?
I'm saying who's causing this, right? So are Republicans, top down, like are Republicans then encouraging Jewish millennials maybe to affiliate with the Republican Party? Or is it something that they're doing independently, looking at how they feel about issues, and then what the two political parties are saying?
So there's a lot there. What I would say is that just looking at this, even though Jewish millennials are statistically more likely to be Republican, it's still less than 25%. I mean, that's still so low. But there is an increase, but still a plurality identify as a Democrat. So I think there is a change that's occurring. But is it a top-down approach? Maybe. I mean, I don't necessarily have the answer to that question. But I think that Jewish millennials still seem to be at least open to Republicans or to Republican ideas, but in many instances, particularly for like social issues, I think it might turn a lot of Jewish millennials and millennials away from the Republican Party. So there, I think, needs, for both parties, they need to do some more work. For Democrats, if Jewish millennials and millennials in general are potentially leaning more towards fiscal conservatism, they might want to reconsider how they view like income inequality, for example, which has been, it seems like a big issue for Democrats in recent years.
We give Kyle a round of applause. I would please like you to take down your slides for your seniors. And again, thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you for the semester with a variety of different activities. Good job, everybody.